success of this event. Friends, in conclusion, I wish to recall that the teachings of the Lord Buddha represents the spirit of universal brotherhood, which we, as member states together in the United Nations system, are aiming to promote. Therefore, we believe that on the day of Vesak, nothing will be more appropriate for the UN than to commemorate the life and ideals of the Enlightened One. From his teachings, I quote, "Hard is to be born as a human being. Hard is the life of mortals. The opportunity to listen to Dhamma does not come easy. Rare is the birth of the Buddha." And end of quote. This evening, we have provided an opportunity for being acquainted with the teachings of the Buddha, a time when humanity has become senseless. Let the words of the two erudite venerables be a cooling shower to pacify our burning minds. I hope that this event brings you peace and solace to your families. Thank you.
His Excellency Mr. Qasim Jomart Tokayev, Director General of the United Nations Office in Geneva, has kindly agreed to be here with us today, and I request Mr. Tokayev to address the gathering.
Dear friends, Minister Amaravira, Ambassador Sanyaviran, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to be with you to commemorate the day of Vesak, which marks the birth, enlightenment, and passing of the Buddha. And I thank Ambassador of Sri Lanka for your kind invitation to be part of your celebration of the 2600th anniversary of the enlightenment of the Buddha. In today's globalized world, where poverty remains endemic, where violent conflicts claim millions of innocent lives, and where climate change and environmental degradation threaten the very future of our planet, the Buddha's message of solidarity and mutual support continues to provide important inspiration for the collective efforts to build a better world. The principles of nonviolence and the equal worth of every human being that are central to Buddhism are particularly relevant to our continued work for peace and progress. The Buddha served as a guiding star for those who were suffering. Therefore, we here at the United Nations must address the plight of vulnerable fellow human beings across the world. The Buddha showed us that we can all strive to become better people and highlighted the unique potential of all human beings. The day of Vesak is therefore a welcome reminder of what we can all achieve as individuals when we set our minds free, and what we can accomplish as the human family when we draw on the potential of all. The universal values of compassion, tolerance, and understanding unite followers of all religions and faiths. Today, as we pay tribute to the timeless teachings of the Buddha, let us pledge to truly respect those universal values and to preach and practice peace, to drive forward development and to promote the dignity of all fellow human beings. In that spirit, I wish you all an enriching and enlightening evening. Thank you for your attention.
It's our privilege to have today with us Venerable Olande Ananda. When Ananda visited Sri Lanka in 1975 as a layman and was ordained in September 1975, he is in charge of the Pagoda Meditation Center in Pagoda, Sri Lanka. When Ananda was born in Amsterdam in 1948, and he completed his degree in Economics and Sociology of Developing Countries at the University of Amsterdam, His wish at the time was to join the UNDP. However, this had not happened, and it is for good, I believe. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to listen to Ven Ananda. May I request Ven Ananda to now speak to the gathering, to be followed by an interactive session.
Good evening, Venerable Sirs of the Mahasangha, and also Venerable Nuns of the Mahasangha, Reverend Sirs of different religions, Your Excellency, the Director General of the United Nations here in Geneva, and Your Excellency, Mrs. Shenuka Senmiratne, the Ambassador for Sri Lanka at the United Nations here in Geneva, and all Your Excellencies who have come to this talk, and also distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, friends in the Dhamma. This evening, I hope to talk about the Buddha's teachings and Buddhism in general under the title, Is Buddhism a Religion, a Philosophy, or a Way of Life? And personally, I think it is a combination of all three. Namely, it is a religion in the sense that it has a founder, the Buddha himself, Gautama, who was Prince Siddhartha and became enlightened exactly 2,600 years on the full moon day of May, Vesak. And then there are scriptures, the Tipitaka, the Buddhist canon as it is called. There is an order of ordained bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, that is called the Sangha, and there are lay followers, both men and women, the Upasakas and Upasikas. Then there are temples with rites and rituals, their preachings, their teachings, and their meditation centers, and therefore we can call Buddhism a type of an organized religion. However, Buddhism distinguishes itself as a religion from most other religions in the sense that it is not theocentric. It's not focusing on God or the Creator God, but more on man and women as well. So mankind is central in Buddhism. The Buddha was born as a man, as a human being. He grew up as a human being, he lived as a human being, and he died as a human being, but as a very special human being, namely someone who had overcome the causes of suffering and attained supreme enlightenment, what we call Samma Sambuddhahood, by himself at a time when those teachings were not available to humankind. A Buddha is a being who comes from time to time, and there are very long periods in between the Buddhas, and is defined as someone, as a human being who has been working on his enlightenment over many, many lifetimes, perfecting good qualities such as generosity and ethics and loving kindness, compassion, wisdom, etc., over many, many lifetimes, and finally, when he appears and gets born in this world as a human being, again, he reaches the final stage of human evolution, as it is called, in the form of full enlightenment, and is then able to also teach that to other beings, how to get enlightened. And that is the main crux of his teachings. So in that way, we can say that Buddhism is an organized religion. It actually started already developing during the lifetime of the Buddha, after he started his first, what is called the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dhamma, the Dhammacakka Pavattana. And he gave a sermon in the Deer Park in Benares, where his first 5 followers listened to his first talk. And that was just 3 months after his enlightenment, now also 2,600 years ago, on the full moon of July. And there, the Buddhism actually started developing. He got more followers, laymen, laywomen, kings and beggars and all kinds of people, bankers and businessmen and even prostitutes who followed him, and people in general from the high to the low society became followers of the Buddha, and some of them became monks, and some of them attained enlightenment themselves as a follower of the Buddha, and they are called arahats. And when there were 60 arahats in this world, soon after the Buddha's enlightenment, he sent them in 60 different directions for the welfare of the many and the happiness of the many. Bahu Jana Sukhaya, Bahu Jana Hitaya, as it is called in the original Pali language which the Buddha spoke, a form of Magadhi similar to Sanskrit. And then you could call Buddhism in that sense even a missionary religion, because the Buddha sent his disciples out into the world to spread his words, his wisdom and his compassion for the welfare and the happiness of many. But the Buddha also asked his disciples not to force this onto anyone, and also asked his followers not to accept anything merely on blind belief or mere hearsay, or because it is written in the scriptures, or because the majority of people believe it, or even because the Buddha himself said so, but he asked his followers to actually critically examine his teachings and think about it and analyze it for themselves, and to see whether it is not against reason, and that it is for the good of themselves as well as that of others, and if it makes you peaceful and happy, then you can accept it if it is not unreasonable. That is the kind of teachings that the Buddha gave to the Kalamas, a group of people in the area near Delhi and in North India, where he actually gave freedom of thought and criticism, and therefore Buddhism can also be called a kind of free thinkers movement. Although the Buddha based himself on principles that can be verified by oneself, for instance, the difference between good and bad. For instance, after his enlightenment, the Buddha went back to the palace where he used to live, where he actually was married and had a child, who after the 6 years of ascetic practices he found as a 7-year-old boy, Rahula, and he gave an advice to Rahula, his son, which is even very valid today, nowadays, to judge whether something is good or bad. He said, Rahula, my son, just before you're going to say something or do something, just reflect briefly in your mind what is going to be the outcome if you say this or if you do this. Is it going to be helpful or harmful to the other person and or yourself? And if it is going to be harmful to the other as well as yourself, definitely don't say it, don't do it. And if it's going to be helpful to the other person but a little bit difficult to yourself, you might consider doing it as a kind of helpful deed. And if it is going to be helpful to both parties, definitely you can say it and do it. So definitely that is a kind of ethical standard that the Buddha gave to his son, and is also visible throughout his teachings, which is very universal, like don't do unto to others what you do not want to be done to yourself. It's a kind of ethical teaching of Buddhism. And then we have the teacher, the Buddha himself, his Dhamma, which is the sayings or the discourses that the Buddha gave. And as you may know, the Buddha attained his enlightenment at the age of 35, and he lived up to the ripe age of 80. So he was teaching for 45 years throughout the length and breadth of mostly northern India. And all of his teachings have been listened to by his disciples, especially my namesake, or I am rather his namesake, Ananda. He was the treasurer of the Dhamma. He had listened to all the Buddha's talks, and he had a very good memory. And after the Buddha's passing away at the age of 80, they had the first Buddhist council where 500 holy monks, they're called arahats, gathered in Rajgir in a huge cave, and they decided, well, this is the teaching of the Buddha as it is, and that was according to the memory of Ananda and all his disciples, the Buddha's disciples. And since then, the teachings of the Buddha have been handed down, first orally for a couple of centuries by groups of monks who specialized in his different groups of teachings, the lesser teachings, the shorter teachings, the graduated teachings, the middle-length teachings, the long teachings. They were all classified and then handed down. And it is said that later on in Sri Lanka, at Aluvihara, north of Kandy, the whole Tripitaka, or the three baskets, or the books of Buddhism, were written down on palm leaves, and that was the first written Buddhist texts. Although scholars have found out that there are ancient texts from Afghanistan which are as old, if not older, than the texts from Sri Lanka, which had the Buddha's teachings already inscribed on gold leaf. So Buddhism was written down about 2,300 years, 2,100 years ago. And then Buddhism started spreading wide and far and wide, especially when the Emperor Ashoka in India, or in that Bharata, great country, became a follower of the Buddha himself. And he built 84,000 stupas, monuments, and also many, many monasteries throughout his very vast kingdom. And therefore, Buddhism really spread in India, and the majority of the people in those days apparently followed the Buddha's teachings. Then it went to other countries like Sri Lanka and Thailand, Burma, also to Nepal, and it spread also to places which is nowadays called Bangladesh, but that was part of India, Bengal, and to Malaysia and Indonesia, then via Vietnam into China and Tibet, and also to Korea and Japan. That was already in the 1st century AD. Then the 5th century, there was another wave where Buddhism went into China, 7th century into Tibet, and then from China into Korea and Japan. So it was really spreading all over Asia, and only relatively recently Buddhism has spread to what we call the West, including Australia and New Zealand, but also Europe and the United States, and even South America. And that is a very recent development. There have been some scholars in the 18th, 19th century, and very few people actually knew what Buddhism was about. But since around the 1930s and 50s, and especially since the 1970s, Buddhism has found a very ready audience in the so-called Western countries who were ready for teachings of the Buddha to get peace of mind and happiness within oneself in a turbulent world where one can actually do something with one's own mind to achieve a state of calmness and happiness within, and also facing the world and its problems with equanimity. Now, the Shakespearean teachings of facing the world, like in the soliloquy of Hamlet, where Hamlet says, to be or not to be, that is the question, and to face the vicissitudes of life and the ups and downs of life with, or fighting them, and by opposing end them, he thought that you could overcome your suffering by escaping from the world, maybe even through killing oneself, to die. Perchance to dream, he also added. That is a kind of reference to rebirth in Shakespeare. But anyhow, the way of Buddha's facing the world and the vicissitudes of life, what is called the 8 worldly Dhammas, gain and loss, happiness and unhappiness, praise and blame and things like that, every human being goes through. Most people will react with likes and dislikes to the pleasant and the unpleasant things. They love to gain and they don't like to lose. They like to be happy and they hate to be unhappy. And they don't want to be blamed, but they are happy to be praised. But the Buddha said these kind of things we should face with some kind of equanimity, not with indifference, that it doesn't matter, but with equanimity, which is a very positive quality in the great qualities of mind that the Buddha taught and showed us in his own personal example, such as universal loving kindness, what we call metta, that is friendliness to all beings, karuna, the compassion for suffering beings, and put that into action, then sympathetic joy, to be happy with the happiness and welfare of others. That is a rare quality. Most people get jealous when other people are doing well, but this is the opposite of jealousy and can be developed as a positive quality to be happy with the progress and the happiness of others. And then equanimity, what we call upekkha. And this equanimity can help us to guard our minds against depressions and elations, namely not to get down and depressed by the bad things that happen to us, personally or in our work situation or in the world at large, all the problems that are facing the world and oneself, but rather to face these things with, patience and with mindfulness, with understanding and with equanimity. So these are some of the great qualities that the Buddha had already developed to the greatest extent and asked his followers also to emulate as an example from him. So nowadays we do have these teachings of the Buddha called the Dhamma, his sayings, also the higher philosophy and psychology of the Buddha's teachings, which are called Abhidhamma. And psychiatrists nowadays are amazed that the Buddha already knew so much about the states of mind that people can get into and how he analyzed the mind. It was 2,600 years ago, without any previous knowledge of other psychologists and psychiatrists and doctors and instruments. The Buddha for himself gave a great classification of states of mind, how they arise, how you can see them, and how you can overcome certain negative states of mind, which are based on greed, hatred, jealousy, and ignorance or delusion. So to overcome all this, the Buddha gave a path which we call the Dhamma, as a kind of boat or vehicle to cross the ocean of suffering from this shore to the other shore. The other shore is seen as the attainment of nirvana, or the highest happiness and peace that a human being can attain. And this nirvana is not some kind of heaven or a place that we go to after death, but it is a realization of a state of mind that can be attained already in this lifetime, such as the Buddha himself showed by his own example at the age of 35. He attained the bliss of nirvana and the peace of nirvana, but he lived quite actively for another 45 years, going all over that vast area along the banks of the Ganges in the northern part of India especially, and meeting thousands and 10,000s of people and helping them to overcome their suffering. The Buddha said basically there are 4 noble truths which are always true whether there is a Buddha or not. And they are universally true and to be experienced for everyone for themselves. Namely, the truth of dukkha, as he called it, or unsatisfactoriness, sometimes translated as suffering, the truth of suffering. But the Buddha called it dukkha, which has been later translated not as suffering but as unsatisfactoriness. The unsatisfactoriness of existence from birth, growing up, getting sick, growing old, to get what you don't want and not to get what you want, and to be separated from those whom you love and situations which you like, and to be confronted with people and situations that one doesn't like. So to have that kind of suffering is a kind of unsatisfactoriness that all beings go through. But then the Buddha said there are 2 major factors that perpetuate this unsatisfactoriness and suffering. Namely, within oneself one can find these factors in the form of grasping and clinging attachment. It's called tanha, craving for sense objects, craving for becoming, and even craving for not becoming, a kind of suicidal craving. So that is all based on another factor, the main factor, namely delusion or ignorance. What the Buddha called ignorance or avidya in Pali language is not that we don't know the books, that we haven't read anything, that we are what is called an ignoramus or something like that, but rather not to see the things as they really are. That is called ignorance in the Buddha's sense of the word. And that is a form of delusion. So not to see the things as they are makes for a kind of conflict between what is and what you hope or fear that things are. And to resolve that conflict, we have to replace that ignorance or the delusion by wisdom. Wisdom and insight are the cure for this delusion. And therefore, actually, the Buddha was teaching how to actually attain wisdom, together with compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, and all the good qualities. But the wisdom is something that the Buddha really taught as the culmination of all our efforts, not as a kind of accumulation of knowledge and facts and figures and pass an exam and then you have your wisdom certificate, but rather as a way of overcoming our delusion. So the Buddha said there are 3 types of ways of getting wisdom. One is to listen to wisdom teachings, like listening to the Buddha's teachings. Nowadays we have those teachings only as handed down more than 2,600 years. But then there are people, also followers of the Buddha, who have attained certain stages of realization and who can also pass on these teachings of the Buddha. And listening to such teachings may give you an opportunity to get real wisdom. But usually what happens with those ways of teaching is that it goes in one ear and out the other. And very little remains sort of between the two ears in our brains and our minds. We mostly forget what the teacher has been saying. Maybe 90% gets lost in that way. So that is not a satisfactory way of attaining real wisdom or realization for oneself. Most of us will have to think about those teachings and maybe discuss it with an expert or somebody who knows more than us. And those are called Dhamma Vichaya, the investigation of the Dhamma, and Dhamma Sakaccha, or Dhamma discussions, discussing the wisdom teachings. And that may lead to another kind of wisdom, which is called Chintamaya Prajna, or the wisdom which arises from thought and thinking and investigation. Now that may also be just an intellectual affair and end up with conclusions and concepts that we cling to and think now we have found the truth. But it may not be the ultimate truth. So the Buddha said there is yet another higher and deeper, more profound way of getting wisdom, and that is the wisdom that comes through meditation, insight wisdom, or self-realization. And that is the highest wisdom that we can attain by using a certain development of our mind, which is called the development of awareness, or mindfulness training, to be aware of, to pay attention to what one is doing with one's body, what one is doing with one's words, and what is happening in our mind, to be aware of body, feelings, mind, and the characteristics of mind, as the Buddha put it. If one pays attention to all these things, and we don't really have to go far to get knowledge or wisdom out of that. The Buddha said, just start with yourself. You are the closest and the dearest and the nearest to yourself, and that's where you have to start. We don't have to analyze the universe and the stars and the moon and the deep oceans and the subatomic particles to get to that wisdom. That's a different kind of field of science altogether. But even the Buddha seems to have known the atomic existence of atoms, maybe not subatomic. Yes, he even went as far as the emptiness of matter and also the infinity of the universe. That kind of knowledge the Buddha also had 2006 years ago, and the infinity of universes that we are now slowly discovering through the pictures that we get from the Hubble telescope and after that. But the Buddha already knew this, but he said way beyond that, and more important than that, is to overcome the causes of suffering which you can find within yourself. And that can be done by really overcoming the delusions that we usually suffer under. And what are those delusions that the Buddha mentions? The delusion of permanence. Now, of course, we have these permanent missions to the United Nations. Sorry, but there is no such thing as real permanence in the world. You see, but it's relatively permanent, let's put it that way. And the Buddha said all things are actually impermanent. All conditioned things are impermanent, and that's the truth. But we hope that they are more permanent than they really are. Like James Bond said, diamonds are forever, isn't it? But if you really look at a diamond under an electronic microscope, you would see that there's a lot of space between the little particles within the diamond. If you go deeper and deeper in the subatomic level, you find that there's only energy, no matter. So the truth of the matter is that there's no matter. It's just energy. So here we have what the Buddha has called the different levels of reality. One is called the relative reality with which we have to deal in daily life. and therefore we can easily call it permanent mission to the United Nations without any problem, as long as we have the real understanding of it, and then to see the deeper meaning that actually everything conditioned is bound to change and is therefore impermanent. And also we are suffering under delusion of happiness, so-called happiness. What we think is happiness, and of course the song "Happiness is different things to different people" shows that happiness means different things to different people. But the Buddha said there are two types mainly of happiness. He mentioned four, but let us say the main two types of happiness. One is called worldly happiness. The happiness that we derive from seeing beautiful things, hearing beautiful sounds, smelling nice smells, and having good food, nice touch sensations, and beautiful thoughts. So all our senses are satisfied, and that is what we call happiness. But the Buddha said, look, this is just worldly happiness. There's another kind of happiness which is not dependent on your senses and the objects of your senses, but which is basically to be found within yourself, within your mind. It's an independent, unconditioned kind of happiness that transcends all human understanding. And therefore that is the kind of happiness which he found in what is called the attainment of nirvana, which is a kind of birthless, deathless, unconditioned state, sometimes seen as the highest happiness, the deepest peace, and the greatest security that we can find within ourselves and within this world. You can't find it in the outer world, but it can be found within yourself. So the Buddha said all these four noble truths are actually to be found within yourself. The truth of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, the causes of this unsatisfactoriness, the greed, attachment, craving, plus the ignorance. And then the end of this suffering also can be found within yourself, and that is called the third noble truth of Buddha's four noble truths. And so you don't really have to go anywhere to find that. The Buddha said it is basically already within yourself, this unconditioned state. You cannot find it outside of yourself. It's a bit similar to the saying, heaven is within you, in the other religions. And then the path leading to the attainment of happiness, peace, and security and nirvana is called the Eightfold Noble Path, a kind of way towards liberation from our causes of suffering. And the Buddha showed us a path of ethics, mental development, which we could call meditation, and wisdom. So the ethics we talked about in the beginning, when the Buddha said to his son, just to consider what to say and what not to say, like before you say and do something, consider whether it's helpful or harmful to the other person and yourself, and within 1 second, just take a deep breath and you will know what it is like, and then you can avoid getting into trouble. And you don't have to say to the other, oh sorry, I didn't mean to say it, I didn't mean to do this, but then the harm has already been done. May be very good sometimes for the leaders in the world to take a good breath and think twice before they act. So that is one of the advices of the Buddha, not to do harm and to try to overcome the causes of suffering within oneself. And if that can be done in numbers, that means if many people find that kind of peace and harmony within themselves, then of course the causes for war even would be slowly eliminated, because most causes for war seem to come from greed, hatred, and delusion. And those are exactly the three major causes that the Buddha pointed out as the cause for suffering. Greed for money, wealth, power, oil, territory, position, etc. And then the hatred towards those and people and things that we don't know. So actually in Buddhism we find that kings and bankers and well-wishers supported the Buddha in constructing a number of monasteries, temples, where the monks could stay for the rainy season. In Sri Lanka as well as in India, you find, and in many other Asian countries, you find monsoons where the rains come down. And during that time, the monks were supposed to stay in monasteries, and that's how the big monasteries and smaller monasteries were constructed during the time of the Buddha, and offered sometimes by the kings of those days and wealthy people like Anathapindika, a kind of a banker in those days. And then what happened is, after the Buddha had attained his enlightenment, his former wife and also his foster mother, because his own mother had passed away 7 days after his own birth, and a retinue of 500 ladies from the Sakyan court came to see the Buddha and asked him for ordination. Women's ordination was not known in those days, and the Buddha was the first one to give ordination to women, although we should add reluctantly. After 3 times pleading by his disciple and his nephew Ananda, the Buddha gave consent to start the Bhikkhuni order, and that was the first women's religious order in the world. And it still exists in an unbroken lineage, actually in places like China and in Korea and in Vietnam, and nowadays also even in Sri Lanka the Bhikkhuni order has come up in a big way, and even Thailand and Burma reluctantly are following it. Once actually I read that some of the leaders in our Buddhism said to get the Bhikkhuni order restarted in a place like Sri Lanka, no man, no God, nobody can do it, we need another Buddha. But when my friend from Ladakh heard that, he said, but nobody can stop it either. So that is probably how the Bhikkhuni order is going to be quite popular, and in places like China, Taiwan, also Hong Kong, Singapore, and especially in Korea also, and in Vietnam, you find lots and lots of ordained women who are leaders in the Buddhist clergy and in the world. So, we can also think a little bit about, is it just Buddha's teachings, is it religion, but is it also philosophy? And I think we already talked quite a bit about the philosophical aspect of Buddha's teachings. Philosophy and psychology, as in the higher teachings of the Buddha, definitely is part and parcel of Buddha's teachings. Some people say, we don't need the temples, we don't need the rituals, we can just do with the philosophy of Buddhism. Well, it is one possibility, but Buddhism is not a philosophy which sort of is suspended in mid-air, somewhere floating high up, but it is a philosophy with the feet, both feet, firmly on the ground as well. It is a practical philosophy which one can put into practice in one's own daily life. So therefore it is something like global thinking and local acting. Like Gandhi used to advise us, think globally and act locally. It's a very Buddhist kind of advice also. And then, is it a way of life? Well, if one actually puts it into practice, and that can be done through the observance of the ethical rules, the practice of mindfulness, the practice of loving kindness and compassion, and the development of wisdom, and put that into daily life, because that is actually what we are living most of the time. It's not a scholarly exercise or living in an ivory tower, but from morning till night, facing the problems of one's life, hopefully with patience and with generosity and with loving kindness and compassion combined with wisdom. And if we have all those factors together, then I suppose nothing much can go wrong. And in that way, Buddhism becomes a real way of life, something that one can practice oneself. The Buddha actually briefly, it's a very vast subject, but he was speaking about 5 kinds of laws of cause and effect. One he calls the law of the seed, the bijaniyana, the seed that we inherit from our parents and our forefathers. We could call it our biological inheritance, the way that we look sometimes like our grandfather or grandmother, the kind of diseases that we may inherit from one of our forefathers or grandmothers, and that is called the biological law of cause and effect. Another law that the Buddha mentioned is the law of the environment in which we live. Not only the physical environment, like the climate, whether you live in a cold climate or in a hot climate, dry or wet, but also the economic climate, the social climate, even the political climate in which we grow up has a large influence on our lives. And then the Buddha mentioned the karma, the law of cause and effect that is created within our own minds, based on our intentions, whether the intention is based on greed, hatred and delusion, then it is called an unskillful karmic act, or whether it is based on generosity, loving kindness, compassion and wisdom, then it's called a skillful act of karma. And we are the creators of our own karma, and we are also the recipients of the results of our own karma. But according to Buddhism, this karma, law of karma, doesn't work only in this particular life, from birth to death, but also it works from life to life. Buddha was teaching also the continuation of life in the form of rebirth. The physical body comes to an end, it is born and it dies, but what we call the stream of consciousness, or the person, the mind of the person, continues and seeks another rebirth as long as the causes for rebirth have not been overcome. As long as one has not attained nirvana, there will be rebirth, according to the Buddha. And those karmic formations, the law of cause and effect in the ethical sphere, they also go back many, many lifetimes. But of course, most of us cannot remember even what we had for breakfast on the 13th of October last year, let alone that we remember what we did in our previous lives. But nowadays, through hypnotic regression, and the Buddha said, through the practice of deep meditation and getting your mind concentrated to deep, deep levels, you may be able to recall your previous lives. And the Buddha himself recalled not only 1, 5, 10, not 100, but he could recall thousands of his previous lives. He knew where he was, who he was in his previous lives. And he said, this is such a complex system of cause and effect, only the law of karma itself, that we cannot really understand it by thinking about it with our logical and limited linear thinking mind. It is what is called an achinte, an unthinkable, but it is there. And together with the other laws which I mentioned of cause and effect in the form of seed, the climate, then the karma, there are some more laws which the Buddha pointed out, namely the law of our own mind. The mind that the human being has differentiates itself from other kind of beings, let's say the animal realm. Animals are reacting instinctively, whereas human beings can act and react according to their discrimination of their choice between good and bad, for instance. To do something or not to do something, or to do it in a different way, in a better way, or sometimes worse. People have that kind of freedom and that kind of responsibility also as a human being to choose for the good or to choose for the bad, or to not do something if they can. So that is the prerogative of a human being, and that is also the way out from samsara, or the ocean of existence from birth, death and rebirth, if one really goes into it deeply. But there's not enough time to go into it too deeply now. because we're almost coming to our interactive session, that means question and answer period. I just want to mention one more law of the 5 laws. I've just mentioned 4. The 5th one is the law of the nature, Dhamma Niyama. The law of nature being the influences of nature itself, of the planets, for instance, the sun and the moon and the other planets. Like astrology teaches that it does matter under what kind of constellation you were born, and that more or less determines partly the probability of your life, in which way it is going. Then, of course, all the other factors, also your own karma and your own efforts and your education and the influence of your peer groups and all that also determines. But it is a whole complex. So the Buddha's teachings are not that easy, but if you sum it up in the teachings of ethics, mental development and wisdom as a form of a way of liberation from our suffering, then we can say Buddha's teachings are practical and can be realized in this lifetime by ourselves. Then it becomes really a way of life based on the Buddha's teachings. So therefore, listening to the teachings of Buddha and thinking about it, and then maybe in a little while in an interactive session of questions and answers, in which you are requested to put any question that you have. You can ask anything, but I cannot guarantee an answer to every question. That is my problem. It makes me more vulnerable than venerable, I would say. But anyway, you're invited to ask questions, and if you have any point that you would like to explain a little further, please don't hesitate to do so. Thank you.